Welcome to Living in Connection, where we explore the nature of physical and non-physical reality and what that means in your life.
Oh, hello again. I'm Dirk Dunning.
Frank DeMarco.
And we had just had a discussion about how to deal with and how to use what the world shares with us to understand our own issues and illuminate them. I think where we wanted to go next was how do we project positive actions out into the world or
Yeah,
something like that. Is that about
the last session we talked basically about you get all this negative stuff out of the world and how can you use it to make productive use of it for yourself. And we've gone into that. But you did have a suggestion right at the end, and I like it. And that is how can we, in changing ourselves, change the world for the better? I think that would be one way to look at it. Is that a fair statement
right?
of what you
I think it is, yes.
All right. If so, you want your guys to start off, or you yourself, whichever.
Well, let's see where it goes. Yeah, they want to talk. So, actually, I'm having the problem of both trying to talk and having them talk at the same time. Let
Oh,
go.
I meant to talk to you about that. Why don't you just tell them no? Wait, somebody used to have that problem. A woman I knew a long time ago, and somebody suggested to her, just tell them slower and wait, and they did, and it solved the problem. So why don't you just? Yeah, I don't
Yeah,
know. I don't understand why you guys don't. They didn't learn to share when they were in kindergarten. That's what's going on.
or I didn't. Who
Well,
knows?
it's possible.
It's the telephone problem of who speaks first and having the collision, but that's okay. So here, let's just do this. These are things that you've experienced in the world already in many different forms. Um, you were thinking earlier, as Frank was talking about, an example that you have from driving, of being out and driving in the world. And if you're thinking in particular ways where you're focused in a particular mindset, that cars will cluster around you. And you just end up in a knot of traffic where everybody's hugging you, if you will. And that you can then choose to change your mind and basically break up that energetic connection. Well, the same thing can apply with both positive and negative forces interacting in the world, where if you want to change the world in a positive way, one way to do that is to be that positive change internal to yourself and to allow that to radiate out into the world and for the world to share that with you. Partly that's dropping your own boundaries, and partly it's about expressing that intent clearly and sharing it out into the space that is the connections with others in the world. And that can have effects far beyond what you might expect, and not just in the immediate moment, but even delayed reactions. Actually, and that's a topic we'll go back to a little bit later. But the interactions that occur because of a resonance kind of interaction with others. Insofar as they're able to accept it, they will. Insofar as they're not, they won't. And so what you might want to do is to start with smaller actions that will allow the resonance to build, and then slowly adjust those over time to increase the effect that you see mirrored back to you in the world. Does that make sense?
It does. And as you're saying that, I'm hearing, the Maharshi effect, where people
Mhm.
vibrate, they meditate together to bring peace and harmony to a certain area. I'm getting, as you're saying that we could use sustained conscious intent to join up with others who we may never meet, who are on the same wavelength
Mhm.
with the same values and intent. That rather than being individuals, rather than sharpshooters, you want an army. Although it's a little violent a metaphor, but it is true. Hang on a second. Go ahead. It is true that the universe will respond as slightly to the universe will as you change your vibrations, it isn't that the universe changes as much as you become aware of a different aspect of the universe, the one that matches your new vibration. If you have several of you together, the effect spirals, increases, fortifies. Anyway, all right. If this is very vague, I'm losing it. I try it again. It isn't so much that the universe or the reality around you, even limiting it to the physical reality around you, it isn't so much that it changes. It's that you attach to, that's what they said, a different part of it, and therefore it looks different. And therefore, to all extents and purposes, it is different. Now you would say the child is still starving in Somalia or wherever the child happens to be, but you might, by raising your vibrations conceptually, you might raise the vibrations of those around that child who are allowing it to starve, whether by intent, by indifference, or by inadvertence, for whatever reason. So you see, it's one way of looking at it is increase your vibrations, and you can increase other people's vibrations, which in turn will have an effect on the environment. And of course, unfortunately, it works the other way around too. Lower your vibrations and being in connection with people of lower vibrations, it gets worse and worse and worse. And you call that politics. At least today you do.
Yep. We would suggest that you also think carefully about the language, that in dealing with the subconscious and other people's subconsciouses, the languaging that the subconscious understands is not quite the same as what is evident in your conscious world. In particular, the subconscious is not good with dealing with negation, but even more so, it takes things that are said and heard as fact, whether or not they really are. And so if you use negative kinds of thoughts, those will be taken as real, even if they're not. And so if you're trying to impact positive change, it's important to express it in ways that use metaphors that are positive and that express it in positive ways in order for the resonance to build to support those. Otherwise, as you suggest, it can cause the opposite effect.
Well, as you listen to what you just said, though, the effect would be if you tell it things that aren't true but that are positive, and it takes them to be true, that it will then do that. And in a way, that's a way of describing faith or of hope or of sustained intent. It works both ways.
It works both ways. This is correct.
You need to be careful what you're doing. Yeah. But it's always a good idea to know what you're doing.
Absolutely. And in doing this, the small steps are important, so that if you try to make too large of a conceptual leap, it'll be recognized by other people's conscious minds as being untrue, which will effectively end the capability to make action. If you can do it in small enough steps, it builds.
It will probably be recognized by your own self as well. You'll feel that you are pretending. Correct. It's like people who try to get themselves into perfect health from a situation. They can only conceive of what they can conceive of. It's silly to try and go. It's not silly. It's ineffective to try and go farther than that. As you're saying, it has to be believable.
Yes.
Now,
and if you earnestly believe that something cannot be done, your body will enact that.
Oh yeah, yeah. If you're sure it can't be done, you're right. The universe always gives you what you said. But we have to throw this one in because you're liable to not want to hear it or to forget it, and that is the results on the 3D playing field are not the important part here. The 3D playing field is the intermediate part. What you are ultimately when you go beyond the 3D boot camp is what is actually matters. And this is why the 3D can be terribly, it can be a cacophony, it can be a battleground, it can be full of horrific acts, and it is, that people do to each other and from each other, and yet still fulfill its purpose. That's the sense in which we said all is always well, because it always is the same um, crucible for everybody. You know, you come in here, you're crammed into one place and time space, carried along moment by moment, making your decisions as you go, and at the end, infallibly at the end, you are what you made yourself. System always works.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean the scenery outside the train was comfortable. You know, I mean, there could be atomic bombs, there could be all kinds of things going on. The system still worked. But if you think that the important part is the 3D and anything else is problematical or is an add-on, then it's going to look like, oh, the system doesn't work at all. You know, how can they possibly say all is well? Well, it isn't well in the sense of everything is, but here's another thing. How could it possibly be heavenly when you have 7,000 million people, all of whom have different values and different intents and different needs? It's if it came out harmonious, wouldn't that imply that there was no work to be done anywhere? That everybody is, you know, it's all filled. It can't happen. Well, go ahead.
And that raises the obvious question about what our purpose is in 3D, is what we're actually doing here.
Well, we've never said anything other. 3D allows you to experience delayed consequences so that when you create, you get to see what it's like and you see what it's like and see what it's like. You don't just uncreate immediately as you might in non-3D. 3D is where you can make something that lasts. And that we would say is the whole thing. And of course, not tangential, but in addition to that, 3D is the place where diverse strands that otherwise could never coexist can be made to coexist, and from then on they coexist again in the non 3D. So that is a part of the system that cannot be defeated. It doesn't matter who wins the war. It doesn't matter, you know, who does what to anybody. That is always going to happen. That doesn't mean people are going to make good choices. It doesn't mean they're going to advance in this time. They can really go downhill. But the system functions the way it was meant to function. It's like
well, and I think we also have the aspect that in the delayed functions we find things where what we had thought was the path we wanted is not the path that was needed or best for us. And so what seems to be a negative aspect or a negative action now may actually be the exact right action or right consequence looking at the longer term.
That's right. Plus, what's right for some of your strands may be wrong for others of your strands, and you have to work that out. And that's what we would call unfinished business. That's what some people call karma, because you know you're in there. You have created this being, but this new X3D being isn't necessarily internally consistent. It may still have pieces that just can't stand each other, or they have opposite values. Unfinished business. Now we know your joke
give
about
us more examples of that. Give us more examples of that.
Well, supposing someone has one strand that were hunters or fishers. You know, they gathered their food themselves. Another strand is a little more artistic and perhaps a little more sheltered, and they don't believe in hunting and fishing, and they believe it's wrong. Well, there's not a right or a wrong there, but for each one, there's a right or a wrong. The hunter and the fisher says, this is subsistence. This is self-sufficiency. This is how I feed my family. This is not being dependent on something else. The others say, you are taking something's life, you know, and blah, blah, blah. They're all defensible positions. None of them are the last word. None of them are the only way to see things. That's just one example. There could be millions. You supposing you have someone who is one strand is artistic and wants to fashion things, you know, either sculpture or painting or whatever. And another one is very mechanical and looks on that as waste of time. And a third is very aesthetic in a different sense, he wants to read or study philosophy or read religion or do anything, you know. Or speaking of religion, another one is a mystic. They may all have a
Mhm.
very uneasy relationship one with the other, but none of them can be said to be the right one and the other one's the wrong ones. It is in fact the learning to live together that is the work. Now that's work
Mhm.
that's mostly done under the surface because well until they get to know what the threads are, then much more of it can be done in the present, in the conscious. But you see, I mean, you yourself probably have 15 major strands, many of which are not coherent, many of which are, um, the word means that they help each other, and some of which aren't, some of which may be directly opposed to that. It isn't a design flaw. That's part of the job to be done. That's part of the task. And when you get to the end of
The
it, either
tension,
hmm?
the
What was the word?
tension.
I thought you said
The
detention.
no, not tension. Sorry.
I can see you being held after class, but I mean, it's yeah. I mean, that was mostly them, and but I think that's true. That's the real work, and that's why it's funny, you know,
One of
Dirk.
the phrases. Go ahead. One of
Just
the phrases that I've heard my whole life is the idea that opposites attract. And one of the things that I recognized early on is that's actually wrong. Complements attract, and complements have inverse shapes to one another. They are not the same. They, in a sense, are opposite to one another, but that doesn't mean opposition.
well, I can see that very clearly. That's a very clear way to put it about complementary. What would you say about opposition then?
Position can create the tension that's needed sometimes for various actions. I think.
That's interesting. That's a very good correction to say complements attract. But the opposites I think do attract as well, and I'm wondering why. It may be because I used to say that God gives you children who will drive you crazy, meaning here's the line of normality, and you're like over on this side, so the children are over on the other side. It sort of balances the whole structure, you know,
Yeah.
and nobody's happy with it because everybody's going, well, what's wrong with them, you know? But I mean, I don't know. Let's name a couple of oppositions. What would they be? I mean, you could say male and female. That's the first one that comes to mind, but that's really more of a compliment than an
Those are
opposition.
complements.
What would an opposition?
Magnetic fields, if you use something like magnetics, things that are the same oppose each other and the opposites attract. The same thing happens in electric fields, but with
Wouldn't you
other
call
things,
them
it's the other way around.
complementary? Wouldn't you call a positive and a negative field complementary?
I would, yes.
And the same, I mean, electronically as well. We may have
So
to
my
give this some
suspicion
thought.
is actually where the problem is coming in is in our choice in language about what we're intending with the language compared to what's really happening.
I think so. The guys often talk about polarities, and they're saying this is one end of the polarity, this is the other end of the polarity, and that does take away that opposition idea, and it does bring in that
Mhm.
complementary idea. I think you may just have clarified the whole structure right there.
So where does that take us?
Well, I think many people today looking at the world are distressed, and they can see many things that are wrong. They know there are things that are right, but those things don't usually get a lot of ink or a lot of airtime. And
Mhm.
in any case, the way our situation is tends to fragment us and make us feel like we are isolated, and there's not really much we can do about any of those problems. So if
Mhm.
people will realize that working on themselves can have an actual real effect on the outside world, I think that would not
Mhm.
only encourage them, but it would encourage them to do something. And especially this idea, and I like this idea. I hadn't heard them say this before. It makes sense. This idea of working as an army rather than as a couple of sharpshooters really does make
Mhm.
you get the intuitive feeling how much more powerful and attractive it could be, But I think it would be important not to have, let's see what you think of this, but I think it would be important not to have a negative view. I'm going to assemble the people, I'm going to call for a banner of people to oppose X. I think that would be the wrong thing to do. It would be like saying, we're going to have an anti-war rally. Well, anti-war rally is just going to have more war. Have a peace rally.
Exactly.
Yeah. But that goes back to what you were saying earlier about the way the subconscious picks up the negatives, picks them up and distorts them.
I think the next part, and I'd love to hear their input on this, is in recognizing any person or group that feels like they have been oppressed or put down in some way for some long period, and they end up in a very defensive and closed and angry space and responding that way, how we might help to recognize their pain and to help them resolve it. Now, in many cases, you cannot help them directly. It's something they have to help themselves with. But how do we get there?
Well, I think the first thing to do is not go along with the victim-villain mentality. As long as people are feeling sorry for themselves because their great-grandfather starved to death because he didn't get enough food, that may be true. It certainly has been true, or they are racially or sexually or any other way discriminated against. That's all true and is not relevant because you're all children of God, to put it that way, or you're all created out of the non-3D and you're all parts of one another. It isn't like there's good guys and bad guys, absolutely, although there are relatively. So I don't see that it's any different. You get together with all of those that you can of your own wavelength and ask for positive, or envision rather, positive reactions, positive changes rather than negative. In South Africa, when they finally overthrew the apartheid system, the Peace and Reconciliation Commission was really brilliant, because Truth and Reconciliation, because the torturers and all did admit in public what they had done, and they spoke to large groups and admitted it, and so that's the truth end of it. The reconciliation of it was, okay, we're not going to put you to death and we're not going to put you in prison for 30 years. We're going to have to live together. That really was brilliant. Now, whether it'll work in the long run, who knows, but so much better than scapegoating and so much better than victim and villain, because victim and villain always brings in self-righteousness, has to. And self-righteousness is an enemy of truth. Most people wouldn't realize that, but if you think about it, it has to be, because it distorts everything so that you are the spotless victim and he is the villain. Go ahead.
And that did amazing and wonderful things. At the same time, there is still limits to it, where there are still forces within that society about, you're taking away my stuff. You're taking away what's mine. And that's echoing through a generation and more. But that will always be the case, I think.
Exactly. That's what we were going to say. That would still have been there no matter what, but you would have had as well the additional bitterness and the additional division. Nothing is a panacea.
What else have we missed on this topic?
Really, you've said what needs to be said. The question is whether people will be able to hear it, because to some people, what we just said and what you just said won't sound like anything. It'll sound like pietistic wishes. If you haven't done the work on yourself and seen the results, it's very difficult sometimes to believe that there can be. Once you've seen it, once you've experienced it, then you know. But until then, it's an act of faith. And the world as it is doesn't really encourage that kind of act of faith, because between the lines, the world says, you are powerless, everything is a conflict, and other forces are organized and you're not. It's wonderful. And of course, as long as people buy that, then they're powerless.
Well, so, our media very much, particularly in our fractured media of today, is very much along the lines of trying to amp up the dispute in order to draw their own funding and their own, eyes on kind of thing. And so the difficulty then is finding ways to temper that down instead of feeding that monster.
Don't don't overlook the fact that they also see it that way. They may very
Mhm.
well they know where their best monetary interest is, but they also may see it that way and say, "Well, we're just telling the truth." So they would look at
Right.
what you're saying and what we're saying as, "Well, that's wishful thinking. It would be nice, but we have to live in the real world." So yeah, and again, you see, even what you just said borders on there comes a scapegoat. They're people and
Yeah.
they're just as
I
in
heard it as I said it. Yes.
okay. If you realize everybody's doing their best, no matter how pathetic that best may be, it oh, you know what? It has one effect that you may not think of automatically, and that is you start being a little easier in your judgments about yourself. And that helps.
Exactly.
That really does help. So we would say you've said
Don't
what
be
you
so hard on yourself.
don't be so hard on yourself or anybody else.
Or anybody else. Yes. Well, this is probably a good place to stop.
I think so.
Another interesting discussion.
Yeah, very good. You see, the two of you are both learning to take it a little more on faith rather than figuring out what you're going to say ahead of time. You both came in and said, "Well, let's find out what happens," and it worked.
It is a little uncomfortable to start, but it's interesting. And if I think about it, it's more like discussions in the real world of, sitting around the table at the Monroe Institute or someplace else, and you don't know where the discussion is going to go when you start.
No, you don't even know what you're going to say.
Right. Well, until next time.
Works for
Thank
me.
you again.
All right.
All right.
Other than that,
If you enjoyed this episode, please press like. Please press subscribe to stay informed of new episodes as they appear. We would love to hear from you in the comments section below, and we wish you the very best in connecting with your own guidance.